Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver, and this week we are continuing a series that we started 2 weeks ago on the life and writings of C.S. Lewis. In the last two programs, we learned about the life of Clive Staples Lewis, often known as Jack to his friends, and in today's program and the next few episodes, we'll discuss several of Lewis's more theological and apologetical works. Today, we are going to discuss Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, and to help us understand this book better is a colleague of mine here at Dallas Theological Seminary, Dr. Timothy Yoder. Dr. Yoder is an associate professor of theological studies here at DTS. He's been a professor for over 30 years. He teaches courses on theology, philosophy, logic, apologetics, and of special interest to us today, a course on the philosophy of C.S. Lewis he has taught in years past. Dr. Yoder holds a Bachelor of Science from Cairn University, a Master of Divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, a Master of Arts from Marquette University, and a Ph.D. also from Marquette University. Dr. Yoder, welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
Well, it's great to be back with you, enjoying our conversations and our explorations of Lewis's legacy and his writings. And we have a challenging book to consider today.
We do. Even the title, we have to explain, don't we?
We do, yes.
This book was based on a lecture series that Lewis gave in 1943 on the dangers of moral relativism. And this lecture series was given at King's College. In that lecture series and in this book, The Abolition of Man, Lewis explains that if we teach young children that there are no moral absolutes, and that everything is relative, the inevitable result will be the destruction of society as we know it and the abolition of man. Dr. Yoder, would you agree with my summary of this book? And if so, briefly elaborate on this concern of Lewis's.
Yeah, that's right. We can probably unpack that a little bit more, too. First of all, it's an academic book. It was given in an academic setting, and it wasn't revised very much. Frankly, I think this book would be more helpful to us if Lewis had included a little bit more of the intellectual context he's referring to. It certainly is.
You have to read between the lines a
little
bit.
We really do. It's very clever in the discussion at the beginning of the book about the waterfall and the green book. And, you know, there's some clever moments and very vivid imagery, trousered apes and, you know, men without chests. So you can get these pieces, but how they all fit together and how it operates in the context of early 20th century ethics and science, really. You have to fill that in a little bit. And that's what makes this book challenging. It's about 20th century ethics. There are a number of discussions that we probably need to understand. Relativism is not the only target. Also, what philosophers call emotivism or subjectivism. Also, it's a worry about the direction of science. Lewis is not anti-science, but he's worried about what we call today scientism, which is the elevation of science as the only real academic discipline. And he sees that and the kind of technology that emerges from science as being part of the challenge.
Whereas theology used to be the queen of sciences, right?
Exactly.
Thought to be the most important, but now at the time, 20th century, that's no longer the case.
Yeah, I think it's a very astute understanding, right? We did, in the medieval era, they would talk about theology as the queen of the sciences because theology was the most important of the disciplines. Couldn't get right with God unless you pursued theology. But today we might think that science is the queen, right? Science is the one setting the agenda. Our technology and our medicine and drives everything. And in fact, we go to scientists as the experts for all sorts of things. Stephen Hawking, in one of his last books, said that it falls to science to answer all the questions. Philosophy used to be doing that, but now it's so esoteric and so far removed from everyday life. And theology, is hopeless from the start, and so it falls to science to answer all of our questions.
And as a philosopher, you may take issue at that.
As a philosopher and a theologian, I take issue with both of his criticisms, but I understand that we live in an era of science. And Lewis understood that and was worried about the direction that was taking.
Well, I highly encourage the reading of this book and Lewis's other books, but there are definitely some challenges that we face when reading Lewis. One, he's very intelligent, has an incredible vocabulary, and utilizes some very complex metaphors think secondly, he's British, so some of the words he uses are unfamiliar to those of us who don't speak the Queen's English. And third, his works are older. This one is over 75 years old, so words may be less commonly used. So sometimes it does take some work to look up a word that Lewis uses or pause to understand the context of a statement he employs. Dr. Yoder, that leads me to my question. The first chapter in Abolition of Man is entitled Men Without Chests. Please explain to our listeners what this title is all about.
Yes. Well, I have my dictionary at hand. Men Without Chests is a very dramatic image. It's the title of the chapter, but it doesn't really emerge until almost in the last paragraph where that comes up. It's a reference to Plato's Republic. And in Plato's work, he says that human person is composed of three parts. And the first part is the head, which is the seat of our cognition. That's the rational part. That's reason. That's our head. And then our belly, our midsection, is the desires. And that's really in some ways refers to the emotions. And then between that is our heart. Plato calls this the spirited part, the heart or the lungs, our desire. He distinguishes between our desire and our emotions. And what Lewis wants to do in this book, he believes that the desires are very important and that the desires can be trained. A lot of people, even, and this is I think true today, people say, well, I want what I want. The heart wants what it wants, and there's nothing we can do about it. And Lewis would say, that's not what the tradition has thought. That's not what Aristotle and Plato and Augustine and Aquinas and many others. And in fact, they argued that a big part of what education was the training of our desires, to learn to love what is good and appropriate. And if we do that, then we're on the path to maturity, and we are a whole person, head, chest, and belly, the rational, the desires, emotional, all coming together. And so what he's worried is that we are people with desires. We got no chest. We got no heart. We got nothing in the middle that brings them together. But that's the image of a person without chest. It's the reason and the desires, but nothing in between that will bring them together.
Well, Lewis begins with a very disturbing quote.
He does.
And the quote reads, "So he sent the word to slay and slew the little children." Dr. Yoder, what's this quote all about?
It's a quote from an old English carol, and it's a reference to the slaughter of the innocents under Herod. Herod put to death the baby boys that were 2 years and under. And so that's what this is a reference to. And what Lewis is using this quote is he believes that just like Herod killed the children, so our contemporary ethics and science, if left unchecked, are going to kill the children, kill them in terms of their souls. The subtitle of this book is Reflection on Education with Special Reference to the Teaching of English in the Upper Forms of School, a very academic sounding and boring sort of title, but he's concerned with the way that the children, the next generation, will suffer under this flawed educational system.
And the idea is being promoted in this little green book we're going to talk about. He's greatly concerned that it's going to kill the children, not literally, but certainly spiritually and emotionally and morally.
Lewis, for all of his life, was not always a fan of school, which is surprising because he was a professor. Now at a university, it's very different. But we talked a couple weeks ago about the fact that Lewis had terrible experiences at schools. And if you read, he's worried about the schools. He's worried about what's being taught, the academic trends that are dismantling good, solid education.
Now to the crux of the book. First of all, Lewis talks about a little green book. What is the little green book he's referring to?
Well, you might remember that I mentioned that Lewis loves nicknames. Everything gets a nickname, right?
Right.
People get nicknamed, houses get nicknamed, schools get nicknames, and books get nicknamed. And if you read the beginning of the book, he says that he gotten a copy of a book. Publishers will send out an examination copy of a book for looking for a blurb or to adopt as a textbook. And so Lewis has this book, which he reads.
He's not going to send an endorsement for this book.
He's not going to be sending an endorsement, no. Lewis's copy of this little green book is housed at Wheaton College, and you can actually look through it, and you can see all of his marginalia. And he says, no, that's not right. What? And all of the kind of running commentary.
Stop by and see that.
Yeah, that's great. The book is called The Control of Language. It was published in 1940 by two men, Alec King and Martin Ketley. They were, I believe, Australians. They were promoting a different approach to the study of literature, and they also had an underlying philosophical agenda, which was informed by that belief that there are no real objective moral values, that there's no real truth in ethics. Rather, what there is our own feelings about things. So that if I say that something something is wrong. I'm not making a categorical factual statement. Murder is wrong or rape is wrong or something like that. But I'm expressing my feelings.
Right.
I don't like that. It's just an expression of our preferences, of our feeling. There's not really any objective truths there.
There's no real right and wrong there. It's our feelings about.
Exactly. So there's not an objective basis. It's just our feeling.
In this little green book, Lewis shares a story that he will use as an example for the rest of the book. Would you tell about that story?
So he gives the book the nickname, the Green Book, and he gives the author's nicknames, Gaius and Titius.
He doesn't mention them by name.
No, he doesn't. Maybe that's being kind. It was annoying for me until I was able to find out what they really were. But Gaius and Titius tell the story about a waterfall. These tourists had gone to see the waterfall, and one of them described it as sublime, and the other described it as pretty. Now, probably the tourists, they were not thinking great logical thoughts. They're on vacation, and they're saying, oh, and this is sublime, and the other one wants to say, but use a different word. It says pretty. But sublime is actually a very strong, important word, and it's a significant aesthetics term, and it means that something that we observed is bigger and more powerful than us. And if you have been at a great waterfall, Niagara Falls or something like that, it's taller and powerful, that the roar of the water and the force, right? It's clearly bigger than a person, right? The same way we would feel about a tornado, about a tsunami, or even a galaxy or something like that. It's bigger and more amazing than us. It instills in us a kind of fear and awe. Yes, the word sublime is better than pretty. It's not really pretty. It's sublime. It's powerful. Now, the two authors, Gaius and Titius, say, well, no, he was actually not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feeling. And Gaius and Titius says what he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or I have sublime feelings. That's what Gaius and Titius says. Well, Lewis erupts with criticisms on a number of levels. First of all, he says he doesn't mean sublime feelings. If the man is talking about feelings at all, it's feelings of humility, right? Of smallness, of this tremendous waterfall, which is great and powerful, has feelings, not a feeling of sublimity. That doesn't even make any sense. It's a feeling of humility. That's first. But what he really wants to attack is the underlying philosophy and what's going on there.
Okay. So again, Little Green Book, two observers of this waterfall, and these two named individuals are the nicknames for these authors, and they're having this philosophical dialogue. Really, this isn't teaching English.
Well, exactly. And Lewis is upset because they're not really teaching literature. He says they're promoting this philosophical agenda about the nature of our statements and what we're saying about what we can know.
So the difference between what is extraordinarily beautiful and I have extraordinarily beautiful feelings associated with the waterfall, that's very different.
It is.
Because there's a substance to, you believe it's beautiful because you know it's beautiful, not just a feeling that it's beautiful.
Something like that, right. So beauty in this case is actually a really important idea for us to pause on for a moment. A lot of people believe that beauty is a kind of frivolous sort of a thing. People are worried about fashion, or they're worried about the arrangement of things in the house, or the color of the curtains, or the fashion of clothing, and it's kind of frivolous and not really important. What we really need is good, strong math, or engineering, or good sound doctrine, or other sorts of things. But Lewis believes, and I agree with him, that we underappreciate beauty. There's an ancient tradition that holds that the things that are most important are the good, the true, and the beautiful. And these are sometimes called the transcendentals, and they are characteristics of God which he communicates to the world. And in the world, God promotes, God displays, God communicates the good, which is ethics, the true, which is theology, philosophy, and because they come from God and they are hearted on the world, therefore they are pointers back to God's nature. And God is, capital G, good. And he is the true, capital T, and he is the beautiful with a capital letter again. Right? He is an embodiment of that. It's not hard to see what it means when we say that God is good and God is true. It is more difficult to see what he means when we say that God is beautiful. Beauty is a really important hallmark of all that God is.
In just a moment, we're going to continue the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. But first, our missions moment of the week. Today's testimonial is from a student at the National Theological College and Graduate School.
My name is Francis Onyinge. For 23 years, I thought I knew Christ. I thought I knew him. But then the moment I was introduced to the NTCGS program and one module after another, I realized I was actually very green. The amount of wisdom that the professors began uploading onto me has really been transformational in a number of ways. One of them is in my family. We used to have these sessions where we would go and sit together and begin praying. The thing is, we would just, talk about the Bible in ways we didn't understand. When I joined NTCGS, I realized that the way we were handling the Bible wasn't the right way. We were really off the mark. My family is growing. We are understanding the Bible better and better. My kids are very interested. Right now, I'm teaching at Global Leadership School. I was given the Bible curriculum because of this training that I am getting from National Theological College. To cut the long story short, I have learned a lot of things. Has really been transformational.
The National Theological College and Graduate School is a strategically placed school with 3 campuses in the Middle East and 1 in East Africa. To learn more about how you can partner with NTCGS in equipping future leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ in Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and East Africa, please visit ntcgs.org. That's ntcgs.org. Now, let's return to our conversation. I'd like for you to comment on Lewis's statement about the authors of the Little Green Book. Mm-hmm. And he writes, the very power of these authors depends on the fact that they are dealing with a boy who thinks he is doing his English prep and has no notion that ethics, theology, and politics are all at stake. It's not a theory they put into his mind, but an assumption which 10 years hence, its origin forgotten and its presence unconscious, will condition him. Lewis uses the term of the conditioners, doesn't he? Mm-hmm. These writers who will condition him to take one side in a controversy which he has never recognized as a controversy at all. Cannot know what is being done to him. Would you unpackage that a little bit for us?
Yeah, he's worried about these underlying philosophical problems. I think it would be more clear if Lewis had taken the time to lay them out more directly. But I think he's worried about the logical positivism that suggests that the only things that we can really trust as true are those that we can verify empirically. But that's really much too high a bar. There's lots of things that we believe in and trust that we can't verify empirically. Can we verify in an empirical way the love that we have for other people, or things like justice or charity? It's a different domain. It's a different category altogether. And Lewis is saying these things are real. These things are important, even though they can't be verified empirically. So Lewis is trying to step back this rather radical philosophy back to a much more traditional approach, which says that we need to acknowledge that there are things that are hard for us to understand scientifically, things like beauty, but they are real, and good education will lead us to learn to love those things, be trained to desire the right things and trained to abhor the wrong things.
So his great concern is this underlying teaching that is being taught, even though they don't know it's being taught. It's an English book, but they're learning philosophy.
Yeah, and he believes that if these things continue, will lead to a society in which we have no mooring, we have no foundation for really prizing what is true and good and beautiful. And he's not just talking about Christian education, he's talking about all education. What we need is to rightly order our desire, to learn to desire the things that are right and to refuse the things that are wrong. Here's a simple example of this. So moms all over the world do this, right? When children drop a piece of candy or a cookie on the ground, they go to pick it up because they're going to put it in their mouth. And so moms all over the world, oh, it's dirty, because the word dirty, especially the way they say it, communicates that we don't want that. It's good when it comes off the plate, right? And it's clean, right? But when it's on the ground, it's dirty. And we're trying to train them to love that which is healthy, to avoid that which is unhealthy and full of germs. In the same way, we should learn to prize those things that are beautiful, good music, good literature, good morals, belief in God, and we should learn to prize those things. Can we prove that all scientifically? No, that's not really the point. The point is that these things are part of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and proper education is embracing that.
So there are moral absolutes.
Absolutely.
Right? there's truth and it's not just subjective and relative.
That's right. There are real truths that are independent of our experience. This is what Plato and Aristotle believed, who were not Christians. This is what Augustine believed, who was a Christian. And actually, in this book, he also quotes from Eastern thinkers, the Hindus and the Chinese, because this tradition is not just a Western tradition,
Right.
but it's part of a global tradition. Ultimately, where he's going to go with this is a defense of what some call the natural law. Moral absolutes that are written in the very fabric of the universe, that are apparent to all people who look with eyes to see, can understand that there are these absolutes, moral absolutes, that are part of the way things are.
He's going to talk a lot about that in Mere Christianity, right?
He is.
The natural law.
There's a pretty simple example of this. We're all familiar as Bible students with the idea, do unto others you have done unto yourself, the golden rule which Jesus teaches. Jesus wasn't the first to say it. It's part of the Jewish rabbinical tradition, but it's also part of the Confucian tradition and the Hindu tradition. And there are versions of this that are found in lots of other ancient religions, which isn't a shock to us if we believe that God reveals his truth through nature, that people all over the world would understand a basic principle of moral reflection is that you should do to others how you would like done to yourself. You don't want to be stolen from, so don't steal from other people. You don't want to be bullied, so don't bully others. You don't want somebody else to cheat on their exam, so don't cheat on yours, right? It's a basic principle that applies on all kinds of levels. And this very same idea is found globally. In the appendix of this book, he lists some of these ideas that are found in other traditions that show the universality of some of the teachings, respecting your parents, telling the truth, obeying the government.
So it's universal, it's not subjective. And Lewis writes a very powerful summary of his beliefs regarding this little green book. And he writes, we remove the organ and demand the function. Mm-hmm. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings to be fruitful.
Yeah. So Lewis thinks that we're trying to retain some of the ideas that we like. Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. Mm-hmm. Treat people fairly and honestly. Treat people with justice. These are still popular ideas. But Lewis's point is that these come not from science, not from evolution. They come from the traditional perspective, which is rooted in a theistic worldview, and it's a whole package. You can't just chop off the God part, castrate the gelding, and you expect him to reproduce. It's a vivid, maybe a little uncomfortable image, but he's exactly right. That's what they're expecting, that we're going to cut out all that's necessary and still expect to get the same results.
And so it's going to lead to the destruction of society as we know it and humanity as we know it, which, again, I do think is a little bit prophetic.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly the case that we live in an era that prizes relativism until something bad happens. And then all of a sudden, all of the judgment, the justice, which only comes from a more objective system, requires. We think about mass shootings and the horrors of that. And they are horrible. We need strong moral absolutes so that people treat each other well. It's just wrong to fire a gun at a crowd of people. It's just wrong. And we all know that.
And so the good, the true, and the beautiful, we want to teach these things, help students, young people at young age to understand what is true, what is really good, what is beautiful. Please comment on this statement by Lewis. Speaking of these two writers, these conditioners, as he calls it, these educators, they are rather not men in the old sense, speaking of humanity in the old sense at all. They are, if you like, men who have sacrificed their own share in traditional humanity in order to devote themselves to the task of deciding what humanity shall henceforth mean.
Yeah. Lewis is really worried about this, and he's not the only one. We mentioned Aldous Huxley last week. His powerful book, Brave New World, is about this kind of conditioning in which people are conditioned to be garbage men or to be nurses or to be teachers. And we're just conditioned. We're just trained to do the things that we do, like animals. I think this is where the image of the trousered ape comes, right? That we're just an entity, an organism, an animal, if you will, that can be conditioned to do certain things and to look sophisticated and human, but we're not really. And so what Lewis is trying to defend is this older tradition in which children are trained and educated to learn to prize what is right, to develop their critical thinking so that they freely choose to love what is good, and they freely choose to set aside that which is bad, and they become people with judgment and discernment, people that prize what is good and true and beautiful.
And again, all of that presupposes that there is something that is good,
Exactly.
that there is something that's true, that
it's
there
not
is something
just an
beautiful.
idea. It's not just a construct, but it's real because it comes from the God who is the true, the good, and the beautiful.
I started a little bit late in life as far as children. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, so this is very serious, something that all parents should think about. But the result of the philosophy of the Little Green Book, that there is no absolute truth, everything's just subjective feelings, will result in the destruction of man as we know it, the enslavement of man, as Lewis puts it. And Lewis is most alarmed because this is being taught early on in school systems, in English class, no less, not philosophy class, but English. Lewis calls the authors of this Little Green Book the innovators, later the conditioners. Dr. Yoder, would you comment just a bit about the powerful impact that educators have?
The Bible warns that not many should be teachers, right? Because teachers have a responsibility to be influencers, to set the tone, that we need to pass on what we know so that the next generation can grow and develop the truth, what is right and true. For us as Christians, this means Christian theology. And what Lewis is worried about is that these individuals, Gaius and Titius, and those of their kind, they are stripping out the old Christian systems for new kinds of things, whether it's utilitarianism or emotivism, or whether it's naturalistic Darwinism, or whether it's socialism. All these isms, the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries are full of all of these isms, and most of them are efforts to replace Christian theism of the earlier times. He's not necessarily proposing, and neither am I, doing away with the separation of church and state, and I'm not advocating for a Christian kingdom or a Christian nation. I think Christianity applies best to people, not to nations and things like that. And yet, there is something about Christianity that is very important. There's something about its philosophy, if you will, that ought to be promoted and disseminated in ethics and in the basic notions of a society, of marriage, and of the rule of law, of basic morals and virtues. That's what Lewis is about.
Using the waterfall analogy, Lewis argues, if the waterfall is not truly beautiful, objective truth, right, then the cruel dictator is not really cruel either. Please explain.
It's another one of Lewis's reductio ad absurdum, right? He's combating ideas by showing that if you really take the path of Gaius and Titius, pursue it far enough, you will see that it crumbles. And that's the case, right? Because they're stripping away the necessary foundations and trying to get the same conclusion without the supporting foundation.
Well, as we wrap up this podcast, would you share with our listeners why this discussion and this book in particular is very relevant to us even today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is an important book. It's not an easy book. There's a heavy lifting that has to take place to understand it well. But the book is important because it affirms, strengthens, it supports these very traditional understandings of what it means to be a person, what it means to be a civilization, what it means to be a society, and the place of these established virtues. We need these. This is important for all people. In some senses, this isn't really even just a Christian concern. This is a human concern. We need a society that displays the genuine principles of right living. A society in which there are mass shootings or egregious acts of injustice or other sorts of things is not a society that can last. For a society to last, we need the virtues of love, and justice, and charity, to train our children to love what is right and good, and to learn to resist that which is wrong. And those have always been true.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Yoder, for taking the time to help us understand this book and think through the implications of it. And to our listeners, I trust that you've been challenged by today's discussion and the importance of moral and theological education of our children, not only for the Christian lives of our own children, but the implications on society as a whole. And did you know here at Dallas Theological Seminary, we have a Master of Arts in Apologetics and Evangelism? Dr. Yoder is in charge of that degree program, and if you'd like to sit under the teaching of Dr. Yoder and other incredible professors here at Dallas Theological Seminary, you can learn more at dts.edu. That's dts.edu. I do hope that you'll join us again next week as Dr. Yoder will return to the podcast studio, and we will discuss one of Lewis's most famous books, Mere Christianity. You won't want to miss that discussion. But until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters because what you believe determines how you behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.